Shut her gate and start the engines. Charles's voice thundered through the mist like a war command. The sound hit me before the meaning did. Then came the deep growl of diesel engines, the metallic shriek of gears shifting, and the low, dreadful hum of something enormous coming alive. I stumbled to the window, heart pounding, breath fogging the glass. 3 yellow bulldozers lined up at the end of my gravel drive, their lights cutting through the early morning fog like search beams. For a second, I thought I was still dreaming. My robe was half open, feet bare, mind dazed. But the noise was real, the scent of diesel thick enough to choke on, gravel crunching as boots and tires chewed into my land. My late father's wind chime clanged violently against the porch beam, a metallic scream against the chaos outside. I shoved open the door, the cold air biting at my skin, and yelled, "Stop! What are you doing on my property?" Charles Benton turned toward me, clipboard in hand, his reflective vest glowing like arrogance personified. Even at 57, he carried himself like a foreman, chin up, chest out, the kind of man who believed rules applied to everyone but him. "Good morning, Rachel," he called out, as if this were a friendly visit. "Cedar Hollow's community expansion begins today. You've had plenty of notice." "Notice?" I snapped. "What notice? You can't just send bulldozers onto private property." He smirked, flipping a single sheet of paper from his clipboard, its corners smudged with dirt. "We sent letters to all affected residents," he said, waving it lazily. "But since you never attend HOA meetings, I suppose you missed that part." I snatched the paper from his hand. It looked official. Cedar Hollow Estates letterhead, some legal jargon about redevelopment and zoning, but the county seal looked wrong. Faded, pixelated, like someone had printed it on a home computer. "This isn't signed by the county," I said, voice trembling with disbelief. Charles leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "You're holding up progress, Rachel. This land could benefit everyone. A community center, a lakeside pavilion, but you'd rather sit in that old shack your daddy left behind." His smirk widened, the words sliding out like venom. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The workers revved their engines, waiting for his signal. The ground vibrated beneath my feet, and I felt something deeper than fear. It was betrayal. My father had built this cabin with his hands, laid every plank of that porch, carved our initials into the foundation post when I was 6. I could still hear his voice. "This land is our history, kiddo. Never let anyone take it from you." I looked at the machines, then back at Charles. "If those bulldozers touch my fence, I'll call the sheriff," I warned, gripping the paper tighter. He straightened his vest, amused. "You go ahead," he said, taking a step back toward his truck. "But make it quick." He turned to the crew, raising his hand. "You've got 7 days before this land isn't hers anymore." The engines roared again, echoing through the valley. My wind chime went silent, the only sound now my heartbeat hammering in my ears. 7 days. That's all the time I apparently had before they erased my father's legacy. And the place I called home. The notice wasn't just fake, it was sloppy. I could see the county seal bleeding through the printer ink, the kind of blur that comes from a cheap office copier. And yet, Charles had waved it around like it was gospel. His last words still echoed in my head as I slammed the cabin door shut behind me. "You'll regret fighting this, Rachel." I set the so-called notice down on my kitchen table, smoothing it flat with shaking hands. The paper smelled faintly of gasoline and damp earth from his clipboard, but underneath that, I could smell deceit. The more I studied it, the worse it looked. The formatting was off, the margins uneven. The signature block read Office of County Zoning, but there was no signature, no initials, no embossed stamp. It was theater, not law. I pulled out my phone and compared the seal to a real one from a document I'd filed years ago. The difference was obvious. The HOA had faked it. My stomach dropped. If they'd forged this, how many other papers had they approved the same way? I walked into my father's old study, the scent of cedar and dust clinging to the air like memory. The desk was still there. Old oak, sturdy, the same one where he used to balance his checkbook after long days fishing the lake. I opened the bottom drawer and found what I was looking for. A battered metal file box with a small brass label that read Monroe Property Deed. Inside were folded maps, notarized documents, and one thick paper deed. The real one. My father's handwriting covered the margins, neat and deliberate. He'd written measurements, drawn sketches of the boundary trees, and labeled the old stone markers along the lake. As I unfolded the map, a memory came rushing back. I was maybe 10 years old, standing beside him as he hammered a small stake into the ground. He'd said, "Remember this line, Rachel. Someday someone will come with a pen and a promise and they'll try to move it. Men who build power from lies always start with paper." My throat tightened as I traced the boundary line with my finger. My cabin, my dock, even the garden sat clearly outside the HOA's mapped area. I had proof. But something didn't add up. According to the official notice Charles handed me, the HOA's boundary extended 50 feet farther into my land, swallowing my cabin whole. That wasn't an accident. I opened my laptop and logged into the county's public zoning database, scrolling through the parcel maps. The digital version showed something terrifying. The boundaries had been changed. A faint line now cut directly through my property, exactly where the bulldozers had stopped that morning. My heart pounded as I checked the timestamp. Updated. 2 months ago. Someone with access had altered official county records. I grabbed my phone and called the county land records office. "Hi, this is Rachel Monroe. I need to verify a parcel boundary for Cedar Hollow Estates," I said, trying to sound calm. The clerk on the other end hesitated before replying, "That's interesting timing. You're not the first homeowner asking about discrepancies." Her tone said more than her words. Something was wrong, and it went far beyond a zoning error. As I ended the call, I stared at the glowing screen, at the red lines slicing through my property, lines someone had drawn to erase me. And I knew exactly whose hand guided that pen. "Move your junk or we'll move it for you." The man's voice cut through the still air like a whip. I stepped outside to find 2 men from down the road hammering a bright orange sign into my yard. "Progress starts here," it read in bold, cheerful letters. Their pickup truck idled in my driveway, country music blasting from the speakers, as if they were celebrating something. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, forcing my voice to stay calm. "That's private property," I said evenly. "Take your sign and your truck off my land." They laughed. "HOA authorization," one of them replied, jerking his thumb toward the laminated badge clipped to his vest. "We're promoting community unity." Charles said anyone against the expansions got to be reminded who owns what. The words hit like a slap. Reminded who owns what. By that afternoon, my trash bin was gone. The collection truck rolled right past my house as if I didn't exist. A day later, my mailbox disappeared, ripped clean off the post. Someone had scrawled, "Move out," in chalk across my driveway. The whisper network kicked in almost immediately. Neighbors who once waved politely now crossed the street to avoid me. A woman from 2 doors down muttered loud enough for me to hear, "Some people just hate progress." It was coordinated. All of it. I started documenting everything, video recordings, time-stamped photos, even copies of my outgoing mail receipts. If they were going to wage war, I wasn't showing up unarmed. On the 3rd day, I caught 2 teenagers, both sons of board members, sneaking behind my fence with paint cans. They froze when they saw my phone recording. I didn't yell. I didn't chase them. I simply said, "Smile for the police report." They dropped the cans and bolted. But the truth? I didn't trust the police either. The sheriff's office had already dismissed my first complaint as an HOA dispute. That's when I realized I was on my own. At least almost. One evening, as I was reinstalling the mailbox myself, I heard gravel crunch behind me. Mike Dalton, my next-door neighbor, stood there holding a flashlight and 2 cups of coffee. Mike was a retired cop, widowed, the kind of man who didn't talk unless it mattered. "Rough week?" he asked. "Something like that," I said, forcing a tired smile. He glanced at the new sign Charles had posted at the neighborhood entrance. Cedar Hollow expansion, building our future. Then he looked at me and said quietly, I know what they're doing, Rachel. I've seen bullies like Benton before. They'll push until someone pushes back harder. I'm keeping records, I said, nodding toward my phone. Good, he replied. Keep every receipt, every video. Men like him always trip on their own lies. His tone was calm, but firm, like advice from someone who'd fought his own wars and carried the scars to prove it. The next evening, I decided to see for myself what they were saying behind closed doors. The HOA was hosting a special board meeting at the community hall. I slipped in quietly, sitting near the back with my phone recording in my coat pocket. Charles stood at the front, pacing with the energy of a preacher. We're done waiting, he shouted to the board. That cabin's been a thorn in our side long enough. She'll be gone before month's end, one way or another. The room erupted in murmurs, some uneasy, others nodding in agreement. I stopped recording, heart pounding. He wasn't bluffing. He was planning. And now I had proof. At the county office, the clerk looked around nervously and said, If Charles finds out I told you this, I could lose my job. Her voice was barely above a whisper, almost lost under the drone of the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. The whole place smelled of dust, paper, and old coffee. The scent of bureaucracy and secrets. I'd come straight from that HOA meeting the night before, the one where Charles had promised to get rid of me by the end of the month. I didn't sleep a minute. By morning, I was standing in front of the county clerk's counter, a folder under my arm, demanding to see the zoning files for Cedar Hollow Estates. At first, the clerk, a woman in her 50s with gray curls and weary eyes, repeated the same line 3 times. All zoning documents are public record, but property boundary disputes must be submitted through official request forms. Her tone was rehearsed, mechanical, the kind of answer designed to make people give up. But when I mentioned the words forged notice and altered county map, something shifted. She blinked hard, then asked me to lower my voice. What exactly are you looking for? I slid the fake notice across the counter, pointing at the pixelated seal and missing signature. She studied it for a long moment, then sighed. This isn't county issued. Whoever made this didn't even use the right template. Then how is it in your system? I asked. The county zoning map was updated 2 months ago, and it moved my property line 50 feet. Her eyes darted to the hallway camera, then back to me. Follow me, she murmured. She led me through a narrow corridor that smelled faintly of printer toner and mildew. We entered a back office lined with filing cabinets, all labeled by year and district. The hum of the lights grew louder, blending with the faint buzz of an old computer at the corner desk. The clerk logged into her system and typed quietly. After a few seconds, she turned the monitor toward me. On the screen was a financial ledger, Cedar Hollow Estates Homeowners Association. The word delinquent was stamped in red across the top. What does that mean? I asked. It means, she said carefully, your HOA is behind on loan payments. Several quarters overdue. The county's been alerted, and the lender filed a notice of concern last month. Who's the lender? Blue Ridge Bank, she whispered. They financed the HOA's community improvement loan about 3 years ago. It's in bad shape. I stared at the monitor, trying to process it. All this harassment, all this sudden expansion talk, it wasn't about progress. It was about money. They were broke, and Charles was gambling the neighborhood to save himself. She must have seen the realization on my face, because she added softly, under state law, any homeowner can request copies of the HOA's financial records. They're required to disclose their debt obligations. Most people don't know that. I nodded slowly, my pulse quickening. If the HOA was collapsing financially, I had leverage. Maybe even a way to fight back. The clerk glanced toward the hallway again, then reached into a folder on her desk. She scribbled something on a sticky note and slid it across to me. This conversation didn't happen, she said quietly. I looked down at the note. Written in blue ink were 5 words that would change everything. Blue Ridge Bank, loan file, Dr. CH 404. Hey, get away from there, I screamed into the darkness as 2 flashlights flickered near my dock, and then came the sound that made my stomach drop. A sharp, splintering snap. The rope holding my dock to shore gave way, followed by the hollow thud of wood bumping against the lake's edge. I sprinted barefoot down the slope, gravel biting into my feet, but by the time I reached the waterline, the dock was already drifting out into the black. The moonlight caught 2 silhouettes in a small rowboat, paddling fast toward the opposite shore. One of them turned just long enough for the light to catch his vest, an HOA maintenance vest. "Cowards!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the water. They didn't even look back. By morning, my dock, the one my father had built plank by plank 30 years ago, was halfway across Pine Lake, wedged into the reeds near the far bank. The boards he'd cut by hand, the bolts he'd tightened while humming old country tunes, all of it gone, drifting like a memory torn loose. I stood there staring at the empty space where it used to be, my throat tight and burning. When the sheriff arrived, I thought for a moment there might be justice, but the deputy barely glanced at my phone video before handing it back. "Looks like a property dispute, ma'am," he said. "HOA issues are civil, not criminal. File a complaint with them directly." "Are you kidding me?" I snapped. "They destroyed my property." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I get that, but unless there's proof of intent, it's not a police matter." Then he got in his cruiser and drove away, the gravel spraying from his tires like a final insult. That afternoon, I attended the next HOA meeting. I didn't want to, but I needed to face them. The conference room was packed, residents whispering, papers rustling. Charles stood at the podium, wearing a tailored jacket and his usual smug expression. "As some of you may have heard," he began, his voice smooth as oil, "there was an incident at the lake last night. One of our members neglected proper dock maintenance, creating a safety hazard. Unfortunately, the dock broke loose and endangered nearby boaters." Laughter rippled through the room. My fists clenched. "That's not what happened," I said, stepping forward. "Someone cut my dock loose. I saw them." Charles tilted his head, pretending concern. "Rachel, the community can't take responsibility for your negligence. You've ignored every safety inspection request." The murmurs grew louder. Neighbors exchanging looks, some glaring at me like I was the problem. I felt heat rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You can spin this however you want," I said evenly. "But I have video footage." 2 men in HOA vests were there. Charles didn't even flinch. "Then by all means," he said, smiling thinly, "turn it over to the authorities. I'm sure they'll find your claims." Interesting. I left before the meeting ended, humiliation burning in my gut. Rage came next, a cold, focused kind that replaced fear with determination. When I got home, something caught my eye on the porch. A thick manila envelope propped against my door. My name was written across the front in black marker, and beneath it, a single stamped line. "Foreclosure notice." I froze. For a moment, the world went silent. Only the faint lapping of the lake in the distance. Whatever Charles was planning, it was far from over. I tore open the envelope expecting my name, but it was theirs. Cedar Hollow HOA, final notice of default. For a full minute, I just stared at it, reading the words over and over. The same man who'd forged my demolition notice, the same HOA that cut my dock loose, was on the verge of losing everything. The notice wasn't meant for me. It must have been slipped into the wrong mailbox. Or maybe, I thought, someone inside the system wanted me to see it. The paper was official this time. Embossed seal, bank watermark, typed signature from Blue Ridge Bank, Commercial Lending Division. My hands trembled as I read the details. Overdue payments, failure to meet loan conditions, risk of foreclosure. I couldn't help it. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that startled even me. All the threats, the arrogance, the talk about progress, it was all built on borrowed money. The HOA wasn't expanding. It was drowning. I sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of me like puzzle pieces. My father had always told me to follow the money when something didn't add up. I opened my laptop and searched Blue Ridge Bank's number. A plan was already forming, dangerous, maybe even reckless, but for the first time since this war started, I felt something close to power. When the banker answered, his voice was smooth, professional. Blue Ridge Community Lending, this is Jonathan Harding. I steadied my tone. Good morning, Mr. Harding, my name's Rachel Monroe. I'm a private investor researching local development opportunities in Cedar Hollow Estates. I came across a file, loan number CH404, and I'm wondering if it's still active. There was a pause, followed by the faint clicking of keys. And may I ask how you came across that loan number, Ms. Monroe? I'm considering funding an upcoming land acquisition, I said quickly. I just need to confirm the status of any existing encumbrances. He hesitated again. I could hear the unease in his silence. Finally he said, that account is confidential, but I can tell you it's not in good standing. Not in good standing, I repeated. Meaning? Meaning the association is in default, he said carefully. They've missed multiple payments, and foreclosure proceedings have been discussed internally. For a second, I forgot to breathe. The mighty Cedar Hollow HOA, the group that thought they could bulldoze my home, was on the edge of collapse. Would the bank be open to a private party acquiring the note? I asked, pretending to sound casual. He paused again. That depends, he said slowly. Are you familiar with loan assignments, Ms. Monroe? Enough to know they're legal, I replied, and that once a note transfers, the new owner becomes the lender of record. There was a faint chuckle on the other end. Surprised, maybe even impressed. You're correct, he said. Anyone who meets the financial qualifications can purchase distressed debt. It's rare for residential associations, but it's not impossible. I sat back, heart pounding. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was planning. For weeks, I'd been the victim. But if I could pull this off, I'd become something else entirely. Mr. Harding lowered his voice. If you're serious, he said, we can talk about transferring the note. I stared out the window toward the lake, where the remnants of my father's dock still floated near the reeds. The same lake Charles had used as his symbol of progress was about to become his undoing. Mrs. Monroe, the banker said, leaning in, his voice low enough to draw the blinds. You understand, this would make you their creditor. His words hung in the air like the moment before a storm. I sat across from him in a small glass-walled office at Blue Ridge Bank, my palms resting flat on the folder in front of me. The table smelled faintly of lemon polish and paper, the scent of big decisions. Outside the window, the town's traffic hummed, oblivious to the fact that a quiet war was being waged inside this office. Jonathan Harding, Regional Lending Director, mid-40s, conservative tie, sharp but cautious eyes, looked at me like he was still trying to figure out whether I was bold or insane. You're not a developer, he said, not a management firm. Why would you want to buy a homeowners association's debt? I hesitated, searching for words that sounded reasonable but true enough to hold. Because they've been mismanaged, I said finally, and because I have a personal stake in the community's future. He studied me for a moment longer before sighing and opening a thick folder. Inside were the HOA's financials, overdue loan schedules, interest penalties, and failed payment extensions. Cedar Hollow Estates, HOA, loan file. CH404. The number I'd written down from the clerk's note, the file that had started all of this. I glanced through the pages, forcing my expression to stay neutral as I read the details of the same people who'd tried to ruin me. Their arrogance had caught up to them. Missed payments, falsified budgets, construction delays. It was all there, in black and white. The total balance is $268,000. Harding said, tapping the page. If you assume this loan, you'll need a down payment to secure the transfer. The remainder would roll into the existing structure under your ownership. How much down? I asked quietly. $85,000. My breath caught. That was nearly everything I had from my father's inheritance and my business line of credit combined. I thought of his cabin, the wind chimes, the dock, every piece of my past that Charles had tried to erase. This was my chance to take it all back, but it would mean risking everything else. Can I set up an LLC for the purchase? I asked. Already in progress, Harding said, sliding a form toward me. We'll register it under your chosen name. That'll keep your personal information separate from the debt file. I stared at the signature line. Monroe Land and Holdings, LLC. A fake company name, but one that suddenly felt powerful, like armor. My hand trembled slightly as I signed the first page, then the second. Fear was there, yes, the kind that made my throat dry and my heart race. But beneath it was something else, a quiet thrill. I wasn't just fighting back anymore. I was stepping onto their battlefield, armed with their own weapon. Harding slid the final document toward me. Once you sign this, the HOA's loan transfers to you, he said. They'll have 30 days before the next payment is due. To you. I took the pen and pressed it to the paper, my father's voice echoing in my head. Don't fight them with anger. Fight them with truth. The pen scratched across the signature line. I set it down, my chest tight, my pulse steady. It was done. Harding stood, offering a small, knowing nod. Congratulations, Mrs. Monroe, he said. You're now the lender of record. I walked out of that bank under the bright afternoon sun, folder in hand, wind catching my hair. The fear had faded, replaced by something sharper, power. And one thought pulsed through me with every step. I own the people who tried to destroy me. Raise your glasses, Charles shouted, his voice booming through the humid summer air as fireworks burst above the lake. The crowd cheered, the colors reflecting in their wine glasses like liquid fire. Laughter, music, and the smell of grilled steak filled the night. Cedar Hollow's HOA Community Expansion Celebration was in full swing. Banners, speeches, champagne, and lies. And there I was, watching from my darkened porch across the lake, the glow of the festivities flickering like a mirage. I could hear Charles's voice echoing across the water, every word coated in arrogance. We're building a better future. Cedar Hollow will be the crown of the county, he declared, raising his glass again. The people clapped, clueless to the truth. Because 3 hours earlier, I had received an email from Blue Ridge Bank confirming the final step of the transaction. The accounts of Cedar Hollow HOA are now under new management. Mine. Every dollar in their checking, their reserves, their project fund, all frozen until further notice. I sat on the porch swing, the old wood creaking beneath me, and let myself smile for the first time in weeks. I didn't need revenge speeches or public scenes. All I needed was time and silence. The fireworks cracked overhead, and I thought about how fitting it was that Charles had scheduled his celebration on the same night his financial leash tightened around his neck. From across the water, I could see him, red-faced and gleeful, holding court among his board members like a conquering king. His wife, Janice, flitted around with a clipboard and champagne flute, ensuring every guest had their fill. The irony was exquisite. Every steak, every light, every bottle of champagne was now being paid for with my money. I raised my coffee mug toward the lake and whispered, "Enjoy it while it lasts." By dawn, the party lights were gone, but the aftermath was already brewing. My phone buzzed with the morning's first notification. ACH transfer denied. Insufficient funds. Then another. Vendor payment declined. The dominoes were falling exactly as planned. By Monday, chaos had replaced celebration. Workers arrived to start clearing land for the expansion, only to find their equipment locked, invoices unpaid. The landscaping company called the HOA office demanding their check. The HOA's maintenance staff never got their payroll. The online project management portal went dark. I stayed quiet. I went about my morning as usual, painting on the porch, coffee beside me, the wind carrying faint echoes of shouting from the HOA clubhouse. By noon, Charles's SUV tore up the main road toward town, gravel spinning behind it. I followed at a distance, parking across the street from Blue Ridge Bank. Through the glass doors, I saw him storm inside, gesturing wildly at the teller's counter. Even from across the lot, I could tell he was yelling. His hand kept slamming against the counter, his face redder by the minute. The young teller disappeared into the back for a moment, then returned with a folded paper. She handed it to him and said something I couldn't hear. He froze. Then she repeated it, loud enough for the security guard to glance up. "You'll have to contact your new lender, Mr. Benton." Charles blinked, confused. Then his expression twisted. Part disbelief, part rage. He shouted something, crumpled the paper, and stormed out, slamming the glass door so hard it rattled the window frames. I stayed in my car a moment longer, watching him stand in the parking lot, shoulders heaving, before driving off in defeat. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of him. Charles kicked open my gate, shouting, "You destroyed everything." And I just smiled, holding the debt transfer papers. The morning light cut across his face, turning the sweat on his forehead into a gleam of fury. Behind him, 3 board members trailed nervously, whispering to one another like school kids caught cheating on a test. He stormed up the path toward my porch, his polished shoes grinding against the gravel. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he barked. "The bank froze our accounts, our checks are bouncing, and our contractors are threatening lawsuits." I kept my voice steady. "Yes, Charles," I said. "I know exactly what I've done." He froze mid-step, his expression shifting from rage to confusion as I held up the folder. The official assignment of loan agreement gleamed under the sun. "As of last week," I continued, "Blue Ridge Bank transferred full ownership of Cedar Hollow's debt to my company, Monroe Land and Holdings, LLC, which means, as of this moment, every cent your HOA owes now belongs to me." The silence that followed was almost beautiful. The board members exchanged glances, the color draining from their faces. Charles blinked, his jaw tightening. "You're lying," he said flatly. "I'm not," I replied, setting the folder on the porch railing. "You can call the bank if you'd like. Or better yet, check the records yourself. Loan file CH404. It's public now." He reached out, snatched the top page, scanned it quickly, and then slammed it back down. "You think this makes you powerful?" he hissed. "You're nothing but a homeowner with a grudge." "Maybe," I said quietly. "But now I'm a homeowner with legal authority. And under U.S. lending law, the assignee of a loan assumes full enforcement rights. That means if the HOA misses another payment, to me, I can foreclose on the association entirely." The board members erupted in panic. "Foreclose?" one of them whispered. "You mean she could—" "Yes," I cut in smoothly. "I could take possession of HOA assets. The lake fund, the maintenance lot, even your office space. Unless, of course, you'd like to discuss a repayment plan." Charles's face turned the color of sunburned brick. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You think you've outsmarted me? I'll have my lawyers on you before the day's out." "I'm sure you will," I said, folding the papers back into the folder. "But here's the thing, Charles. When you play games with people's homes, eventually someone learns the rules better than you." He stared at me for a long, silent moment, jaw working, eyes burning, before turning sharply and signaling to his entourage. "Let's go," he snapped. The others hesitated, glancing back at me as if hoping I'd offer mercy. I didn't. They followed him out the gate, the sound of their voices fading down the road. Inside, I sat by the window, letting the adrenaline settle. My hands trembled slightly as I poured coffee, the weight of what I'd done finally sinking in. I had turned their greed into my weapon, but I knew men like Charles didn't surrender. They regrouped. That evening, an envelope was slid under my door. Thick, white, and stamped Superior Court of North Carolina. The return address read Law Offices of Benton and Hartman. I opened it slowly, scanning the first line. Plaintiff, Charles Benton vs. Defendant, Rachel Monroe, alleging malicious interference and fraudulent acquisition. I exhaled through clenched teeth. He was coming for me again. "Mr. Benton," the judge said, slamming his gavel so hard it echoed through the courtroom. "This entire HOA is a fraud built on intimidation." The room fell silent. You could have heard a pin drop, or the sound of Charles Benton's world collapsing. He stood there at the plaintiff's table, red-faced and sweating through his suit jacket, while his attorney fumbled through a stack of disorganized papers that no longer meant a thing. For weeks I'd waited for this day. Not out of vengeance, but for truth. I sat at the defense table, every piece of evidence neatly arranged in front of me. The forged demolition notice, the altered county zoning maps, the HOA emails that Charles never thought would surface. My attorney, a calm and methodical woman named Ellen Chambers, rose to her feet and spoke like she was reading scripture. "Your Honor," she said, "this case was filed under false pretenses. The plaintiff claims my client acted with malicious intent, but every document he's presented was fabricated. We've submitted certified copies of the county's real records and an affidavit from the zoning clerk verifying that the HOA illegally altered public files." The judge, a stern man in his 60s with tired eyes and a booming voice, looked directly at Charles. "Mr. Benton," he said, "is this true?" Charles hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. We were told." "By whom?" the judge cut in. "You were the HOA president. You were the one signing these fake notices and authorizing these so-called expansion plans." I watched as Charles's composure crumbled. His lawyer tried to object, but the judge waved him off. "Save it," he snapped. "This board used forged documents to intimidate a homeowner. That's not development. That's coercion." Ellen motioned for me to stand. "Mrs. Monroe, would you like to address the court?" I rose, clutching the single-folded page in my hand. My father's letter. My voice trembled at first but steadied as I began to read. "If you're reading this, it means you're standing where I once stood, fighting men who think power gives them the right to take what isn't theirs. But remember, Rachel, land only matters because of what it holds. Memory, family, love. If you protect those things, you've already won." When I finished, the courtroom was quiet. Even the bailiff looked away, eyes glistening. I saw the jurors shift in their seats, their expressions softening, not out of pity, but understanding. The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, "you've endured more than anyone should under a homeowners association. The court finds in your favor. The claim against you is dismissed with prejudice." He wasn't done. Turning back to Charles, he added, "And as for Cedar Hollow HOA, I'm ordering an immediate forensic audit of all financial accounts. If there's been misuse of funds, this court will refer the matter to state investigators." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Charles's attorney whispered something to him, but he didn't move. His face had gone pale, his confidence drained. As the gavel came down again, Ellen leaned toward me and whispered, "It's over." But before we could leave, one of the auditors, a young man in a gray suit who'd been quietly reviewing documents behind us, touched Ellen's arm. His face was pale, his voice barely above a breath. "You'll want to see these expense reports," he said, eyes flicking toward Charles. "It's worse than we thought." "Mr. Benton, you're under arrest for embezzlement and fraud," the detective said. Right in the middle of the HOA meeting, the room froze. Every head turned toward Charles as two plainclothes officers stepped forward, badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. For a split second, he looked confused, then his face drained of color. The papers in his hands slipped to the floor, scattering like fallen leaves. It had only been a week since the judge ordered the forensic audit, and the results had come in faster than anyone expected. The auditors uncovered nearly 2 years of consulting fees, fake invoices totaling more than $180,000, payments to shell companies that didn't exist, transfers labeled as contractor reimbursements that led straight to a personal account in Charles's name. When the findings were turned over to the county's financial crimes unit, they didn't waste any time. This morning's meeting had been scheduled to discuss restructuring the HOA's finances. Instead, it became the scene of its own reckoning. Charles's voice broke through the silence. "You can't do this here," he shouted, stepping back as the officers closed in. "I am the HOA. I built this community." One of the detectives read him his rights as the other placed handcuffs around his wrists. The metallic click echoed in the stunned room. I sat quietly in the back row watching. My hands were clasped together in my lap, steady for the first time in months. Charles's gaze darted around, desperate for support. but the very board members who used to hang on his every word now avoided eye contact. Charles Benton, the lead detective, continued, "You're being charged under State Statute 1490 for embezzlement of fiduciary funds and under Federal Title 18, Section 11341 for wire fraud." It was over. Outside, the news spread through Cedar Hollow faster than wildfire. By evening, every porch light in the neighborhood flicked on as clusters of residents gathered, whispering and pointing as squad cars pulled away. The once proud HOA sign that read, "Cedar Hollow Estates, Building Our Future," now stood crooked, one corner broken, like a metaphor that didn't need explaining. People who'd ignored me for months now came to my gate, some to apologize, others just to gawk. I wasn't cruel about it. I simply nodded and went back to sanding the porch railing my father had built. Vindication didn't need applause. It was quiet, steady, and deeply satisfying. One of my neighbors, a woman named Linda, came over with tears in her eyes. "Rachel," she said softly, "we were wrong about you. He told us you were trying to ruin the neighborhood." I gave a small smile. "He was half right," I said. "I ruined his version of it." The legal details would take weeks to settle. The audit's report became public record, showing every fraudulent dollar and every lie attached to it. HOA meetings were suspended indefinitely, and a county-appointed trustee took temporary control of the association. Still, even as justice played out on paper, I couldn't shake the image of Charles being led out of that room. The man who'd once stood above everyone now reduced to silence and handcuffs. That evening, as the sun set behind the lake, my phone rang. It was a local reporter. "Ms. Monroe," she said, "how does it feel to have taken down the most powerful man in Cedar Hollow?" I looked out across the water, where the reflection of my rebuilt dock shimmered against the ripples. "I didn't destroy the HOA," I said quietly. "Their greed did." 1 year later, I stood on my porch as the sun rose over Pine Lake. The same cabin they tried to erase now stood stronger than ever. The reflection of the water rippled with gold and amber light, and the wind carried the faint scent of pine and morning dew. For the first time in a long while, there was silence. Not the tense waiting kind that used to fill the air before another confrontation, but a peace that hummed with life. The birds had returned. The neighbors waved again. The fear that once clung to this place had finally let go. Cedar Hollow was not the same place it used to be. The old HOA board was gone, dissolved by court order after Charles Benton's arrest. The county appointed a temporary administrator to handle the mess, and what they uncovered during those months could have filled a novel. Unpaid taxes, fake consulting contracts, and secret accounts labeled under names no one recognized. Charles had built his empire on lies, and when it collapsed, it took his reputation and his power with it. At first, the community was lost. People didn't trust anyone anymore. Every meeting felt like walking on broken glass. Every document was met with suspicion. No one wanted to lead, no one wanted to sign, and no one wanted to believe. I understood that fear because I had lived it, but I also knew that running from what we built didn't honor the fight it took to protect it. So when the county asked for volunteers to form a new, transparent HOA committee, I said yes. Not because I wanted authority, but because I wanted to make sure no one ever abused it again. The first meeting was in the old community hall, the same one where Charles once shouted about progress. The lights flickered, the paint was peeling, but the air felt different this time. Real people filled those seats. Retirees, young families, working folks who'd never had a say before. I could see the weariness in their eyes, but also something new. Hope. I opened the meeting with a simple sentence. Cedar Hollow belongs to its people again. That line became our motto. Within months, we drafted a new charter that made every financial record public. We limited board terms to 2 years and required resident approval for every project. We created an online portal where anyone could log in and see where every dollar went. For the first time, there were no secrets. And just like that, the poison that had infected this place for years began to fade. Neighbors who once glared at me now waved when they passed my gate. Some stopped to chat. Some even apologized. I didn't hold grudges. I understood how fear makes people believe what they're told. One evening, Linda, the woman who once accused me of hating progress, brought me a homemade pie and said quietly, "You were right, Rachel. You just fought sooner than the rest of us realized we had to." Still, not everything could be fixed. There were houses that stood empty, families who'd moved away during the turmoil and never came back. And sometimes, when I walked the lake trail at dusk, I could almost hear echoes of the old battles. The shouting, the engines, the fear. Scars remain, not to remind us of pain, but of survival. I often think about my father during these quiet mornings. The cabin still carries his touch, the steady craftsmanship of his hands, the chisel marks on the porch beams, the initials he carved into the foundation when I was a child. I remember him telling me, "Land only matters because of what it holds." Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. Now I do. This place isn't just wood and soil, it's memory, legacy, and love. They tried to turn it into leverage, but they never understood that you can't bulldoze history. The dock, the one they destroyed, is back too. I rebuilt it plank by plank with Mike Dalton's help. He's retired now, but he still insists on doing the heavy lifting. At the very edge of the new dock, I had a small brass plate mounted. It reads, "For Dad, who knew that home is more than land. When the sun hits it just right, it shines like gold." Sometimes I sit there at dawn, barefoot and quiet, listening to the water slap gently against the posts. That sound reminds me I won. Not out of vengeance, but out of endurance. I never used my power over the HOA. After the courts cleared the case, I legally remained the holder of their debt. A technicality, but one that gave me leverage. I could have foreclosed on the association, liquidated their assets, or even dissolved it entirely. But I didn't. I wanted them to see that true control isn't in destruction, it's in restraint. I left the loan intact, interest-free on one condition, that Cedar Hollow would forever remain transparent to its members. They agreed unanimously. Sometimes reporters still call, asking for interviews, trying to spin the story into some local legend about the woman who bought her HOA. I decline every time. My story doesn't need headlines. It's written in the quiet mornings, in the smell of pine sap, and in the creak of the porch where my father once sat with his coffee, watching the same sunrise. Would you fight back the way I did, or would you walk away? Tell me below. I want to know what kind of person you'd be when the bulldozers come for your peace. And next time, I'll tell you about a family who discovered their HOA secretly sold their backyard to a private developer, and what they did to take it back. They tried to take my home, so I bought their power.